It's funny how certain things can happen and then it turns into a memory unlocked. And one of the things that I was thinking about is how we acquired, as goth girls, a lot of our clothing back in the day. And one of the things that used to make me laugh is when normie people, like people outside the subculture or outside alternative in general, would be curious where we would get a lot of the clothes that we did. Because again, there wasn't a lot of alternative stores around back then. And the ones that were, they were very pricey. So we had to get creative. And by getting creative, that meant a lot of DIY and that meant a lot of thrift shopping. So one of the things that made me laugh was a lot of the clothes that we would get, like a lot of our things were like slips, a lot of vintage nightwear. People outside the subculture or people outside alternative would get grossed out because we were getting a lot of our clothes from used underwear sections of thrift stores. And that was always our port of call. We would always go straight for that section. Goth girls from the 90s, you remember this, we would go straight for that nightwear / underwear section. And we were looking for things like girdles, bustiers, old 1960s nightgowns, slips, especially slips. And we wore those things out. We either DIY'd them, we dyed them, we left them as they were or layered them, because the very cool thing about slips is that the fabric of slips are so thin, you could layer them one on top of the other, sometimes 3-4 at a time. And if you layered these things, you could get a really interesting look because they'd be different colors, different lengths, different trims, and you would get a really interesting look out of the thing. So these are things that we went to. And another thing that we really looked at are 1960s nightgowns. And the reason that these were coveted back then is because of the way that they were kind of put together and the way that they were designed. So if you kind of took some of the colors that these things were in and then you changed the color, it went from very chiffon, embellished bust, long floor length kind of boudoir nightgown in a hot pink to vampire bride. And all it took was some bottle of dye and it would change the look entirely. And I'm going to show you an example as to why that worked. The nightgown, the peignoir, or if you were really lucky, the nightgown peignoir set. It's easy to see why these were such coveted thrift store finds. You had satin, lace, sculpted bust lines, layers of billowy chiffon, and you'd end up with these ethereal vampire bride gowns. Sometimes you really lucked out and they came gothed up straight out of the gate, meaning that they were already black when you'd found them. Job done, and a little work done on your part other than putting your own personal spin on it by way of accessories or some DIY. When they were extra long, I really liked to shred the hem and make them look like death shrouds. These days, I couldn't stand to take a scissor to them, seeing how few and far between they really are. But back in the 90s, these were plentiful and they were cheap. Sometimes you find one that's constructed like a dream, but in a color that's charming and true to the era from which it came, but definitely not a color that you'd ever wear. Sometimes they came in colors like Pepto-Bismol, Tang, and avocado, which was such an abomination and an insult to an otherwise beautiful construct. It made you wonder what went on in that design room. Like, hi, let's make the most billowy ethereal piece with a sculpted ruched bust line and a hand-cut lace inserts. But let's make it the color of a Midwestern salad consisting of Cool Whip, Jell-O mix, and canned fruit. That's where Rit Fabric Dye entered the chat. Saying it out loud makes me smell vinegar. But just for fun, here are a few of the aforementioned pieces I showed you earlier in the slideshow, edited up to show you what a difference that a little accessorizing and fabric dye made when we came across these pieces in an otherwise unfavorable color or with stains that we could not and dare not identify. So as you can see with all these vintage nightgowns, the bones were there. We just had to kind of snap them into place and make the thing work. And it did. It did gross a lot of, I guess, the normies out once they realized that we were donning the used undergarments from strangers. But not like we didn't wash them or anything like that. And there were a few times, even with us, that we faced that dilemma where we would find something incredible, the best fabric, the best shape, and it was perfect. But there were stains on it that were questionable, and you were curious as to whether this was stains from time or if this was biological. So we had to make the choice. Do I take this home? Or do I say, you know what, I'm going to sit this one out? And oftentimes we're like, screw it. I got clothing detergent. We'll just give it a couple washes and throw some fabric dye at it and see where we go. And fortunately, these things were cheap enough that we were able to really fill our wardrobes in it. When I say cheap, I'm talking like there were days where there were church thrift stores where you can fill a bag for 50 cents. They would hand you a bag and say, fill the bag up with as many things as you can for 50 cents. Given how thin the fabric of these slips were, you can imagine we fit quite a few in those bags, and including things like bustiers and things that we really DIY'd and turned into masterpieces. But the thing about DIY is, you know how nowadays if you want to learn how to do something, you go online, you watch a tutorial on how to do it? We didn't have that back then. So if you didn't know how to sew, you kind of had to find somebody to teach you or learn it from a book. And it's harder to learn things from a book, something physical in nature, like the concept of stitching. You really want to see it in motion to really get it. Doesn't mean we didn't learn. It was a bit harder. Nowadays, that kind of thing is really easy. But back then, your ability to DIY was really confined to what you knew, what you had access to, who you knew, etc. So sometimes you acquired a sewing machine, and if you had a sewing machine, fantastic. Sometimes there were people that had sewing machines that did not know how to use them. It took me many years to figure out how to use a sewing machine, but I finally figured it out, learned how to do hand stitches early on. Whereas something like that might come easy to some people, creativity really depends on the person. Some things just don't come as easy to some people as it does to others, and that's okay. Sometimes you're just, that's not the way your brain works. Sometimes you're more technically inclined. Sometimes you're more relating to the written word. Sometimes there's just other things that you can do. Everybody has their niche, and not everybody can really grasp the concept of sewing or DIY. And I'll give you a great example. So back in the 90s, I knew a girl who went to the Fashion Institute of Technology, and she created this incredible Victorian bustled dress to where it was corseted, and it was incredible. And the bustle she hand sculpted to be a staircase shape. It was art. And there were other people who didn't know how to sew, who tried, failed, but they found other ways, and they would attach things to fabric with safety pins. So there was a friend I had also that made a skirt. She had a plain black skirt, but she had bits of fabric from old things that she had ripped up. Lace and crinoline and fishnet, tons of different things that she attached in strips to this skirt and created this amazing layered pixie skirt. Both of them entirely different levels of sewing skill, but incredibly innovative nonetheless. So again, nowadays, what people have access to versus back in the day were different in terms of things like, say, fast fashion. So a lot of people think that those in the 90s didn't really rely on fast fashion when we were on a budget, but we did. So whereas you have places like Romwe, Shein, Nasty Gal, even H&M is considered fast fashion, Forever 21, fast fashion. But here was the difference for us. Whereas you have access to it online, we would have physical stores that we would walk into. So the clothing today is a little bit cheaper because back then there was an overhead. They had rent, they had utilities because they had to keep that electricity on, and they had to pay their employees. So there was a lot of overhead that they had to pay to keep these stores ticking over. So it wasn't a lot more expensive, just a little bit. So oftentimes we would also rely on bits and pieces we can find from there, but thrift stores were way cheaper. Whereas, like I said, you can get like a simple slip dress for 50 cents. Here you can get a slip dress for, say, $12. So even back then, a splurge for us would be going to somewhere like Mandy, Forever 21, 579, and spending the $12 on the dress versus the 50 cents for the slip. And even today, if you're living on a budget and you're kind of forced into fast fashion or DIY or whatever, you can still kind of go high end if you wanted to, because you have things like Afterpay to use. But I don't know if I would trust that. It seems a little bit sus to me, and it freaks me out. I'm like, I don't know. Seems dangerous in some way. There's something, they get you somehow. But for me, my stores were religious sects and there was a store called Religious Sex in New York City. I've mentioned it so many times on my channel, but to me, it was like the most beautiful and intricately handcrafted corsets and gowns and the most beautiful things you'd ever seen, with a price tag to match. And I would go in and treat this place like a museum, but a museum of things that you could touch. And I would only hope to one day to be able to afford something from Religious Sex. And now that I'm an adult, Religious Sex is gone. So my hopes of that have been dashed. But it's nice to have the memories, though, because I can still remember that storefront window. Catwalk collection. It was a catwalk collection. I'll see if I can find a picture for you. It was this sort of velvet kind of Victorian jacket, but they would embellish it with faux fur around the neckline and around the sleeves, and it was corseted. It had a kind of boning in the sense that I think it was kind of based, thinking about it now, on a Victorian riding jacket with the boning and all. And they paired that up with a petticoat, and I remember that being in the front window for ages. But I'm going to get you a picture. So there were ways that we would combine like the old and new, where we would combine the slip with, say, a fishnet top that we had made from old tights. So you'd have like these fishnet sleeves kind of ripped on the inside of a slip. That was a very common dress. And I want to see if I can recreate that one for you. It was a very common one where it was ripped kind of fishnet sleeves underneath a slip, or layers of slip, with just tons of different rosary beads, and the shoes were usually granny boots or little platform Mary Janes or something along the lines of that. And it honestly, it's a cute look. I miss that look because to me it's what I kind of referred to as the standard goth, because there were a lot of different looks that people try to classify nowadays, and one thing that they never talk about is just your standard goth look. And it doesn't really fit any one particular mold that people would look at. Me, if I were to classify it, I would say it's very quintessentially 90s, definitely. And if I see that look put together now, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. I'm thinking, wow, that is so freaking 90s. And it's also kind of timeless. But I want to show you how you can put these things together in a look, and actually how we made the slips work, even though, yes, they are basically undergarments. These are things that people wore under their dresses or skirts to kind of keep it from riding up or showing their hosiery. And that was the original purpose of these things. But you know what? They shouldn't have made them so damn elaborate and pretty, because if they didn't, then us goths wouldn't be going and grabbing them all from the thrift store. So with that being said, I am going to show you some of my vintage slips. So this one is one of my favorites. It kind of, in the light, looks a bit like a royal blue. Kind of have that ruching at the bust. You have this bust line, by the way. This bust line, by the way, is very easy to recreate if you wanted to sew this out of anything. If you want me to do a DIY and show you how to do this, it's surprisingly easy on how to cut this out. We have just a regular simple white one. No real trim to it. Split down the front. And then, believe it or not, this one's my favorite. It's a different fabric, and this one is a bit older than these. I'd say these, the black one is probably, I would say 1960s. The cream one looks about late 70s, early 80s to me. And then there's this one, which is probably more 1950s. And it has the most elaborate and beautiful bust. As you can see, it doesn't have any straps anymore. I just ordered some bra straps because I'm going to be editing this one and I'm going to repair it. So some little loops inside here in the corners where the original ones went, and then I'm just going to attach the bra straps to this, and hopefully I get to show you this one day. Your lies could be